I remember the sound of fluorescent lights more than the voices that morning. Norfolk Naval Station, May 2024. The air inside the admin office was clean in that artificial way, coffee, copier, ink, metal polish. I had been filing transfer reports for Colonel Hayes when the door opened and that sharp smell of cologne entered before the man did. Ethan Walsh, new contractor, mid-30s perfect hair voice that filled every empty space. He looked at my badge, then at me, and smiled the kind of smile men wear when they believe you have spent your life behind a desk. So you're the colonel's secretary. Must be nice to have a desk job at your age. The sentence landed like static on an open channel. I did not look up immediately. Years in the Navy had taught me that silence can be the loudest sound in the room. A few junior officers nearby exchanged glances. One of them, barely 20, muttered under his breath, "Bet she never even left U.S. soil." Their laughter was short, nervous, the kind that tests how much disrespect they can get away with. I took a slow breath, placed the last folder into the cabinet, and turned toward the window where sunlight broke across the framed certificates on the wall. They did not notice the reflection, yet the faint shimmer of a ribbon behind the glass. "Coffee's ready," I said, quietly pressing the intercom. The speakers crackled, releasing a burst of encrypted radio chatter, real Navy code, the kind that only activates when linked to an intercept frequency. Ethan flinched. The young officer's phone buzzed and died in his hand. "That's a live intercept channel," I said. "You might want to turn off your phones." They jam these frequencies. No one moved for a moment. The hum of the fluorescent lights filled the silence. Ethan forced a laugh, trying to recover. "Oh, so you're into comm stuff, huh?" I smiled. "Something like that." Then I turned back to my screen where the monitor still displayed a restricted access seal he could not read. I heard him shift his weight paper rustling. "Guess everyone here's got their little secrets," he said. I let him have the last word because men like him need to feel victorious in rooms that don't belong to them. What he did not see was how the light fell differently on the far wall that morning, the sun catching the edge of a metal plaque just enough to reveal the embossed lettering, United States of America. The words glowed pale gold against the navy blue ribbon inside the frame. I caught my own reflection overlapping it for a second, older, now lines, deeper eyes, quieter. I thought about the years between desert sand and this metal desk, about how people forget that the ones who look ordinary have already walked through fire. Ethan left the room still talking, still loud. When the door shut, the young officer who had laughed earlier coughed and said, "Ma'am, I didn't know you worked signals." I answered simply, "I worked people." His brow furrowed, unsure if it was a joke. It was not. As I reached for my coffee, the handle was warm from the sun. Outside, seagulls circled above Pier 12, their shadows cutting across the asphalt like short memories. I could almost hear the rotor wash of a helicopter from another lifetime. The phone rang. Colonel Hayes wanted the logistics briefing moved up an hour. I said yes, my voice steady. He would never know that the woman behind his schedule once directed a medevac under mortar fire. That was fine. I had made peace with anonymity years ago. What unsettled me was not being forgotten, but being misread. People like Ethan believed silence meant smallness, that calm women were made of softness instead of control. He would learn soon enough. I glanced again at the glass frame. Dust had gathered on the top edge, catching the light. I brushed it away with one finger, revealing the metal's faint outline, the 5-pointed star, the laurel ring, the single word engraved at its heart: honor. The intercom clicked again, feedback whining for a moment before settling into static. The young officers avoided my eyes. Ethan was somewhere down the hall, laughing too loudly at his own jokes. It did not matter. The Navy had taught me patience measured in decades. Some lessons take time to detonate. I took a sip of coffee, its surface trembling slightly from the vibration of the air conditioning unit, and whispered to no one in particular, "Timing is everything." The phone rang again, and as I lifted the receiver, sunlight cut across the room, striking the metal square on. For an instant, the reflection painted the opposite wall in gold. I saw it, and I smiled, because before the day was over, the same man who called me a secretary would learn what that reflection really was. Have you ever smiled while someone buried their own arrogance? Pier 12 wakes early at Norfolk Naval Station in Virginia. The day begins with steel breathing and boots keeping time across the catwalks. The air smells like salt and jet fuel and coffee. I badge into the admin corridor and the sensor gives one short beep. Light settles on gray paint and polished brass. Down the pier, a forklift chirps while gulls argue over a crust of bread. Ordinary keeps this place steady. I keep ordinary on a short leash, so emergencies never grow teeth. My desk sits 3 doors from operations, close enough to hear when a door bangs or a junior officer forgets an indoor voice. The placard reads, Administrative Aide. People assume the title means errand runner. I do not correct them. I align calendars, clean duty rosters, and track the signatures that keep aircraft legal. If a colonel makes a promise at 0800, I make sure it still exists at 1600. If a part is ordered, I check that it appears before the wind turns ugly. Colonel Preston Hayes arrives at 7:15. He is tall, careful, and disciplined. He nods as he passes and sets a folder on the corner of my desk. Mercer moved the logistics brief to 1000 and add maintenance to the last block. Thank you. He speaks like a pilot on final, steady, and precise. He respects competence. He does not ask questions about the past. I prefer it that way. By 7:30, the hall fills with the usual choreography. Supply checks in, legal drops, forms flagged for signature. Public affairs peeks around the door with a camera already humming. I adjust the agenda and ping 3 chiefs for attendance. A weather advisory scrolls across my monitor from the Navy Forecast Office. Storm band building off the coast. Gusts overnight. I tag operations and maintenance and tuck the advisory into the briefing packet. I can feel the day shift under my feet. Lieutenant Riley arrives at 7:45 at a pace designed to be noticed. She is new to the pier and determined to be louder than her shadow. Mom, she says, stretching the vowel so respect sounds like a dare. We do not need grandma energy in operations. I let the sentence rest between us. I set my pen down so gently the click is barely a sound. The best energy in operations is the kind that still works after midnight, I say. She smiles bright and hard and says she thrives after midnight. Good, I answer. We always need help then. I page the duty desk. There is a hole in the patrol schedule for the midnight to 4 block on Pier 12. I ask whether a crew is ready for foul weather walkdowns. The chief says he is short by 1 officer. I suggest Riley. The chief says if she is cleared, he will plug her in. I update the roster and post the revision on the duty board. No speeches, no drama, just an entry that fits weather need and swagger. The morning builds. I finalize the 1000 brief and route the packet to the colonel. He glances over the weather notice and nods once the way good flyers acknowledge turbulence without feeding it. He asks if Ops can handle the gusts. I answer that Ops is already preparing. He does not ask how I know. I send a note to maintenance to confirm engine bleed air inspections on 2 aging birds scheduled for taxi tomorrow. Please confirm the checklist and log it as complete. The reply arrives within minutes. Will confirm and log by end of day. At 9:30, the corridor rings with brisk footsteps. Contractors drift through with tablets and opinions. Ethan Walsh floats past with cologne and confidence. He grins and offers a comment about the coffee machine as if he owns the beans and the water and the time. I let the moment pass like a plane you do not need to board. 1000 arrives like a drumbeat. We file into the conference room. Screens glow. The colonel runs the agenda. I sit near the door with the sign-in sheet and the spare pens that never return. Maintenance gives their update in flat sentences. Ops reviews patrol coverage. Public affairs pitches a video they want to film to capture the energy of the pier. I mark each item and watch the room. Small adjustments keep big things from breaking. When people break, paper holds. After the brief, I return to my desk and work through a stack of clearances. I stop on a request that feels off. A civilian vendor has submitted a badge renewal with a missing field. It is the kind of error that lives just long enough to trip tomorrow. I send it back for correction. I am polite. I am always polite. That is how doors keep opening when you need them to open fast. The afternoon slides in on the back of heavy clouds. I smell rain before it hits. I print the storm plan and tape a copy on the duty board. It reminds walkdowns to check tie-downs, doors intake, covers, fuel caps, and loose equipment. I have written that list so many times I could recite it in my sleep. I add one more note to maintenance. Rerun the engine start checks on aircraft 7-4. Please confirm. The air tastes like rain and electricity. Just before 1600, the first drops rattle the windows. I take calls and move small tasks off tomorrow. The colonel signs 2 forms and heads to a late meeting with the port captain. The corridor empties. Night shift edges in. I pick up the binder for the duty officer and review the midnight plan one more time. Riley passes by in a rain jacket, chin-high, eyes forward. She does not see me watching. That is fine. She will see what matters when the wind rises. The storm crawls over the base after dark. I am home by then, but I do not truly leave the pier. Habit turns me into a radio even without a device. I brew tea and study the radar on my phone. I think about engines and doors and hands on cold metal. At 0240, my phone buzzes with a message from the duty desk. Walk down, complete. Found loose panel latch starboard side. Secured. Thank you for the heads up. I set the phone on the table and breathe out. Sometimes revenge is nothing but competence that arrives 5 hours early. Morning returns clear and silver. I am back at my desk before 7 with a fresh stack of forms and a quiet sense of order. Riley appears in the doorway with rain still in her hair and a different expression. It is smaller and steadier. "Thank you," she says. "Your correction saved us from an engine blowout." I say I am glad the checklist caught it. She shifts on her feet and says she will be in operations if needed. There is no swagger in the sentence. There is only weight. The good kind. By 9, the base sounds normal again. The pier smells like wet rope and diesel and pride. The colonel stops by and asks if the schedule held. I tell him it did. He asks how I knew to adjust it. I say the weather wrote the note for me. He smiles and says, "Carry on." He still does not ask about the frame on my wall. That is all right. Some stories wait for the right room. I turn back to my screen and begin the next set of tasks. Outside, the gulls argue and the clouds open to a clean blue. Somewhere, a young officer who laughed yesterday decides to keep quiet today. Somewhere, a contractor tells a story about the coffee machine that does not require me to listen. And somewhere inside this building, a single line on a roster sits exactly where it belongs, a reminder that storms come and go, and that respect, when it finally arrives, lets the work speak before I do. Kentucky in 1989 smelled like wet soil and gasoline. The house on Franklin Road leaned slightly to the right, as if it had been tired for years. My mother kept curtains drawn to hide the cracks in the wall and the bruises on her arms. My stepfather believed silence was proof that he was in charge. He had the kind of voice that filled the house even when he was in the garage. I learned early how to listen for the change in tone that came before glass broke. At 17, I could pack a bag in under 60 seconds. The Navy recruiting poster at the bus station looked cleaner than any room I had ever known. It promised order meals at regular hours and a bed that belonged to me alone. I joined at 18 with 2 shirts, $40, and a note from my mother that said, "Be careful and come home when you can." She did not hug me. She just pressed her fingers to her lips and nodded like she was sending a prayer without words. The only person who ever defended me as a child was my grandfather, a World War II veteran with the stillness of stone. He had served in the Pacific and kept his uniform pressed in a cedar chest long after his lungs began to fail. When I was 10, he caught my stepfather shouting at me and stepped between us. He never raised his voice. He simply said, "You do not shout at people who can hear better than you." My stepfather left the room and slammed the door hard enough to shake the walls, but he did not shout again that night. My grandfather taught me how to polish shoes, how to read maps, and how to keep my breathing steady when people tried to steal the air around me. His hands shook when he wrote, but his sentences never did. He used to tell me respect is earned in silence, not demanded in noise. At the time, I thought it meant speak softly. Later, I learned it meant survive quietly until the right moment to move. When I left for basic training, he was already in the hospital. I visited the day before I shipped out. He looked smaller than I remembered, skin thin as tracing paper, but his eyes were clear. He handed me a small box wrapped in brown paper and told me to open it when I reached my bunk. I promised to write, though I knew he would not live to read it. He smiled anyway and said, "You will be fine. You always keep time." I did not understand until the first night in training when I opened the box and found a silver pocket watch. The back was engraved with words so shallow I had to tilt it toward the light to read them. Keep time, not grudges. The tick of that watch became the first sound that belonged only to me. Training at Great Lakes was cold and fast. Orders barked through winter air turned to ice before they reached our ears. I was smaller than most recruits, but quicker to learn routines. My fingers remembered the rhythm of my grandfather's lessons. Shine, fold, align, breathe. When other recruits complained, I kept moving. Silence is its own armor. One night in week 6, we were ordered to run the obstacle course in the rain. Mud pulled at our boots. I slipped halfway through and hit the ground hard enough to taste metal. A girl named Sloan offered a hand, but the drill instructor shouted, "Move." I stood and kept running. My knee swelled for days, but the watch still ticked in the locker beside my bunk. Every time I heard it, I remembered the smell of cedar and the sound of my grandfather's slow breathing. The letter from my mother arrived 2 weeks before graduation. It was 3 lines long. He passed quietly on Sunday. He wanted you to have his flag. Do well. I folded the letter into my pocket and went to evening drill without reading it again. During the final inspection, a commander stopped in front of me, asked where I came from, and said, "You stand like you know where you are going." I did not tell him I had nowhere else. After graduation, I was assigned to Communications Training Center in Pensacola. The air smelled of salt and jet fuel, cleaner than Kentucky ever had. I learned to operate signal intercepts, radio encryption, and emergency channel relays. I found I was good at patterns, at reading the silence between frequencies. The instructors noticed. One of them, Chief Ramirez, called me steady as radar. He said I would go far if I learned when to speak. I thought of my grandfather and said I already know. At night, I kept the watch under my pillow. The tick kept time with the sound of waves against the pier. I marked each day by that rhythm, the old world and the new world, sharing one heartbeat. On my first leave, I went home to Kentucky. The house on Franklin Road was smaller than I remembered. My stepfather had lost his job and found more reasons to drink. My mother looked older, her eyes gray with exhaustion. I stayed 2 days and left early on the 3rd morning. When I reached the bus stop, she hugged me for the first time in 10 years. Her hands trembled. She whispered, "Thank you for leaving." I told her she could too, but she only shook her head. The bus door closed before I could say more. Back at base, I understood that the Navy had already become the only home I could keep. It gave me rules, but rules made sense. It gave me missions, but missions had endings. The world before felt like a noise I had finally learned to turn off. The pocket watch stayed with me through every transfer. Sometimes I timed drills with it just to hear the click. Other times I wound it when I needed to remember who I had been before the uniform. I never wore jewelry, but I kept the watch close, a thin chain hidden inside my pocket. Years later, in a desert halfway around the world, I would touch it before every transmission. Its tick was the calm before orders. In 1989, it was just a promise that silence could be a form of power. I did not yet know how true that would become. Afghanistan smelled like metal and smoke long before the first shell hit. Our forward operating base sat near the edge of Helmand Province. Flat sand, stretching until it burned into the mountains. The sky was pale blue, too calm for what waited beneath it. I was 37 Chief Communications Officer for Echo Company, responsible for coordinating medevac and air support. My husband, Captain Caleb Mercer, led the ground patrols. We used to joke that marriage was easier when your arguments came through encrypted radio. At dawn on May 15th, the wind shifted. The first mortar landed near the north gate, and the radio erupted with overlapping voices. Fireline, this is Echo 1 Actual, requesting immediate medevac for 3 wounded. Coordinates followed each syllable strained through static. I repeated the call, marked the grid on the board, and sent the relay to command. Then the second round hit. The blast threw dust across the compound, turning morning into blur. Sirens wailed. I could feel the air thinning as everyone moved toward defensive positions. The command tent became a storm of sound. A young lieutenant from headquarters shouted over the net to hold position until further orders. His voice cracked like he was still waiting for permission to be brave. The incoming fire grew heavier. Reports poured in that Alpha Team was pinned near the wadi with no cover. Their comms were fading. Caleb was there. I heard his voice once clipped and measured, but the signal broke mid-sentence. I requested air support. The reply came back negative. Higher command wanted confirmation of enemy positions first. The order meant delay, and delay meant death. I looked at the tactical map. The drone feed on the secondary monitor showed smoke 2 overturned vehicles and flashes of movement. I knew the coordinates by heart. I switched channels and keyed into the medevac frequency. Falcon 2. This is Echo Command Emergency Extraction Authorization Code Delta Red 7. Launch now. The pilot hesitated. Command had not cleared the airspace. I said I would take responsibility. The words left my mouth before fear could find them. Falcon 2 lifted within 2 minutes. Through the tent flap, I saw the rotor wash tear dust into the air. Shells burst around the landing zone. I could feel the concussion in my chest. The lieutenant shouted that I was violating direct orders. I kept the headset on and told the crew to hold course. 12 soldiers made it onto that helicopter before a rocket struck the ridge beside it. The explosion tore one of the rotors. The craft spun, slammed down, and vanished in fire. I ran before anyone could stop me. Outside, the heat was blinding. The sky looked too bright for the kind of death below it. I crossed the open ground with nothing but the sound of gunfire guiding me. The blast from a secondary explosion threw me to the ground. My ears rang. My mouth tasted of dirt and copper. I saw movement ahead, silhouettes crawling from smoke. I dragged the first man clear, then another. My gloves melted against the metal door of the wreckage. Caleb was near the tail section, shouting for me to go back. Flames licked the sand around us. He was pulling a wounded private when the second explosion hit. The shockwave folded the air and threw both of us in opposite directions. When I reached him again, he was gone. I do not remember screaming. I only remember the heat and the ticking sound of the pocket watch in my chest pocket. Somehow it had survived every deployment. I used it to time the intervals between blasts so I could move when the air stilled. 4 more soldiers crawled out before the fire took the rest. Reinforcements arrived 20 minutes later. They found me covered in ash, still marking coordinates on the dirt with the end of a broken antenna. The report said 12 rescued, 1 deceased, 3 missing. The lieutenant, who had tried to stop me, filed a complaint for insubordination. Command opened an inquiry. For weeks, I relived the fire through transcripts and statements. They asked why I disobeyed orders. I told them because the radio does not bleed. Men do. They said it was not my call. I said neither was survival, but I made it anyway. When the investigation ended, the board acknowledged that my actions had prevented further loss of life. They wrote the words heroism under direct fire and recommended the Medal of Honor. The ceremony took place in a closed room at the Pentagon with no cameras, no press, and no speech. The general shook my hand and said, "The nation thanks you." I nodded and accepted the medal, its ribbon heavy and quiet. Later I learned that public announcements were reserved for frontline combatants, meaning men. The file marked my recognition as internal. There was no parade, no headline. Only a line in a record few would read. Afterward, I walked alone along the reflecting pool in Washington. The air smelled of rain. I took the medal from its box and looked at it under the gray sky. It gleamed the same dull gold as the pocket watch my grandfather had given me. I thought of his words. Respect is earned in silence, not demanded in noise. The silence that day was thick enough to choke on. When I returned to base, they treated me as if nothing had happened. The inquiry officer avoided my eyes. The young lieutenant transferred to another unit. The men who had been rescued sent letters that arrived months apart, each beginning with thank you and ending with an apology they did not owe. I kept them all in the same envelope with Caleb's last note, a piece of paper scorched at the corner that said, "Be careful, I will meet you at the sound of rotors." Nights after the operation, I woke to the smell of smoke that was not there. Sometimes I dreamed of the desert turning to water, the wreckage sinking, the sound of the watch ticking louder than the wind. I stopped wearing it for a while, afraid it might still keep time for someone who no longer could. When the nightmares faded, I wore it again, not as a reminder of grief, but as proof of balance. Keep time, not grudges. But resentment grew anyway, quiet and disciplined. Every year, new names were carved into marble and broadcast on screens, while mine stayed hidden in a file marked classified. I told myself the work mattered more than the recognition, but even patience has a pulse. By 2008, I had learned that silence could save lives. By 2009, I began to wonder if it also erased them. When I came back to Norfolk in 2010, the city smelled of salt and diesel. Ships lined the piers like sleeping giants. I had been away for almost a decade, but the rhythm of the port had not changed. The gulls still screamed over the water. The air still carried the metallic hum of engines idling somewhere beyond sight. I rented a small apartment near Hampton Boulevard at first, but my brother Mark insisted I move into the family house until I got settled. He called it a practical choice. I called it a mistake made out of nostalgia. The house sat on a narrow street lined with sycamores whose roots had cracked the pavement. My mother had died 2 years earlier and left the deed jointly to us. Mark was 50, unemployed, and proud in a way that made poverty sound like a badge. He greeted me at the door with a smirk and a beer in hand. "Well, look at the hero coming home," he said. The living room smelled like dust and fried onions. He had turned my mother's sewing corner into a makeshift office, filled with unpaid bills and promises. He asked how much money the Navy had given me for all the medals. When I told him the truth that it came with none, he laughed and said then what was the point. I unpacked quietly in the room that used to be mine. The walls were still pale green, the same color my mother chose when she wanted to make the house look calm. That first night, I lay awake listening to the house creak. Every sound felt like a question I had avoided for too long. By the second week, Mark began dropping comments during breakfast. "No man wants a woman who outranks him," he said one morning, eyes fixed on the newspaper, but voice sharp enough to cut. I asked if that was his excuse for staying single. He chuckled and said men like him did not need excuses. I poured coffee and said nothing. Silence was a weapon that required patience. He started borrowing my car without asking and using my name on small credit applications. He claimed it was just to help the bank move faster. I checked the mail and found pre-approval offers addressed to Diana M. Jennings. My middle name was Mercer, not Jennings. He had added my information to his. The VA office became my refuge. I went there every Tuesday to sort out benefits paperwork. The building smelled of toner and old carpet, but it had rules, and those rules made sense. I learned the system well enough to help other veterans fill their forms. The clerks began to greet me by name. One afternoon, I asked about property transfers for surviving dependents. The clerk, a thin man with kind eyes, explained the process step by step. He did not ask why I needed to know. By the following month, I had filed the documents to move the deeds solely into my name. The reason listed was estate maintenance for federal loan compliance. Mark never noticed. He only cared that the mortgage was still paid. When the final papers came through, I placed the deed in a folder marked personal and locked it in the cabinet. That night, Mark bragged about a new business opportunity with a friend from the marina. He said they planned to take out a small loan using the house as collateral. I stirred my tea and asked how he planned to do that. He smiled and said the bank already had the old paperwork showing us both as owners. I told him the bank might want to see something more current. He waved me off. 2 weeks later, he came home furious. The loan officer had called to say the property was no longer listed under both names. He demanded to know what I had done. I told him the paperwork must have been updated by the county when they processed estate adjustments. He shouted that I was ruining his life. I said his life had been self-inflicted years before I came back. He stormed out, slamming the door so hard the glass cracked. I sat down and listened to the quiet that followed. It was the same quiet that had saved me before. The next morning, he acted as if nothing had happened. He made pancakes and asked about my job search. I told him I was considering a position at the Norfolk Base again. He said he hoped they still let old ladies carry clipboards. I smiled and said they let competents carry them. The VA office called that afternoon to confirm the property records. The clerk congratulated me on finishing the process without errors. It was the first time in months that paperwork had felt like justice. Life settled into a rhythm of uneasy coexistence. Mark spent most days on the porch, smoking and talking about opportunities that never arrived. I took contract work at the base as an administrative aide, easing my way back into uniformed life without the uniform. Each evening I walked home past the harbor lights, thinking how strange it was that war zones could feel safer than family kitchens. Occasionally, Mark would try to lecture me about loyalty. He said families should stick together. I told him loyalty meant keeping each other afloat, not waiting for one to drown. He stopped talking for a week after that. The following month, he started managing what little money remained in my mother's account. He claimed he was paying utilities. I knew he was using it to cover his debts. I let him think I did not notice. I tracked every withdrawal quietly through online statements and recorded each in a notebook labeled household. The numbers told their own story. Silence again became my ally. When he complained that the electric company was threatening to cut service, I printed the receipts showing I had already paid. He stared at them for a long moment and said nothing. From then on, he stopped touching that account. Revenge did not always require confrontation. Sometimes it only needed proof waiting in a drawer. By winter, the house felt heavier, but peace had a new shape. I went to bed each night knowing the roof above me was truly mine. Mark still tried to assert control in conversation, but his words lost force. The phrase, "no man wants a woman who outranks him," never passed his lips again. I think he realized rank was not about medals. It was about who held the paperwork when it mattered. The house grew quieter that spring, but quiet did not mean peace. It meant Mark had found new ways to make noise without sound. He started using my name again this time, not for loans, but for introductions. I learned through a neighbor that he had been boasting around town about his sister, the war hero, the Medal of Honor recipient, the woman who could open any door at the Navy Yard. He used my story like currency, trading it for free drinks and favors from people who wanted to feel connected to valor. When I confronted him, he shrugged and said it was harmless. People respect the uniform die. I told him respect was not a souvenir, but he had never learned the difference. A month later, he applied for a position at Tidewater Insurance, a mid-level adjuster role that required background verification. He told me about it over dinner, explaining that the hiring manager was a Navy veteran and that dropping my name would seal the deal. I said nothing. The next week, a letter arrived addressed to me but delivered to him by mistake. Inside was a pre-approval request for a credit line in both our names. He had used my social security number. I confronted him again. He laughed and said I was overreacting. The bank needed a guarantor and I was family. I told him family was not collateral. He slammed his glass down and said I was a washed-up clerk playing soldier at a desk. The words hit harder than I expected. It was not the insult, but the tone, the certainty in his voice, as if everything I had survived meant nothing inside those walls. That night, I sat at the kitchen table long after he went to bed. The old photographs on the mantel caught the dim light of the street lamps. One showed Caleb in uniform smiling before deployment. The glass had a small crack across the corner, the kind that happens when something has been dropped but never mended. I remembered the sound of fire, of metal twisting of the voice that went silent before dawn. Mark never understood that silence. The next evening, he came home drunk and angry that Tidewater had delayed his hiring process. He blamed me for not returning a reference call I never received. When I told him so, he sneered and said, "No wonder your husband died first. You talk rules while everyone else takes action." Then he reached for the framed photo of Caleb and threw it into the fireplace. The image caught flame, instantly curling at the edges before I could move. I did not scream. I simply watched until the glass collapsed inward. The room smelled of burnt paper and whiskey. Mark stumbled to bed without another word. I sat alone until the fire died, then swept the ashes into a small tin box and placed it beside the pocket watch. Revenge does not always come from rage. Sometimes it comes from remembering how to document. The next morning while he slept, I went through the old file cabinet in the hallway. Years earlier, I had stored family paperwork there. I found his full name, birth date, and driver's license number. I logged into a public court database and typed them in. The records were not hard to find. 2 DUI arrests, 1 dismissed fraud investigation, and a small claims suit he had lost in 2003. I printed everything, scanned the pages, and saved them as a clean PDF with no traceable metadata. The file name was Simple Applicant Background Review. That afternoon, I sent an anonymous email to the Tidewater Insurance HR department. The message said the applicant currently under review, Mark Jennings, had undisclosed criminal history and attached the documents. I used a public computer at the library to send it. 2 days later, Mark came home furious. He threw his phone on the table and said someone had sabotaged his job. The company had withdrawn their offer after discovering incomplete disclosures. He accused me outright. I looked up from my coffee and said maybe they just did their homework. He paced for an hour, cursing the system, the government, and me in cycles. I stayed silent. Silence again felt like armor, cool and steady. When he finally left the room, I opened my notebook and wrote one sentence under that day's date. Have you ever taught a bully his own record? The next morning, he was unusually polite. He made breakfast and avoided eye contact. For a week, he barely spoke. I think he began to realize that manipulation loses its power once exposed. There were no more applications, no more borrowed names. But I could feel the resentment growing under his skin like a bruise. Sometimes when he walked past my door, I heard him muttering that people only respected what they feared. I smiled to myself. He was half right. The only thing he feared now was a woman who knew how to use paperwork better than he used lies. In early summer, he received a letter from the Department of Revenue regarding unpaid taxes from a business he claimed never existed. I suspected he had registered something years ago under a false name. I left the letter unopened on his desk. Later that night, I heard him tearing it up. The sound was oddly satisfying, like the final echo of an argument that had already been won. I spent more time at the base, taking on longer hours. The structured rhythm of work steadied me. Colonel Hayes, my superior, began noticing my efficiency and calm under pressure. He had no idea how much practice I had at dealing with chaos disguised as family. At home, Mark avoided the topic of jobs entirely. He busied himself with home repairs he never finished patching holes that kept reopening. Each evening, I walked past the fireplace where the photograph once stood. The ashes remained sealed in the tin box placed on the shelf beside my grandfather's watch. The two together felt like a private altar, a reminder that time and justice can both be patient. One night, as I was locking up, Mark said from the hallway that maybe we were both cursed. I turned and said no, just consistent. He did not ask what I meant. By autumn, the air in Norfolk grew cooler, and the shadows inside the house finally stopped shifting. I realized revenge could be quiet, almost merciful if delivered with precision, and I slept better than I had in years. By the start of 2012, I had finally escaped the house that smelled of beer and broken promises. The Navy base felt like order after years of noise. Norfolk Station had changed since I left active duty. New steel, new buildings, but the same hum of discipline and the same faint vibration in the floors when a destroyer left port. I returned as a civilian operations coordinator, a title vague enough to hide the weight it carried. Most of the staff were younger men who had never seen war beyond recruitment videos. They called me ma'am with politeness that barely hid their condescension. The first week I heard whispers in the hallway. "Paper lady is back. Guess she files faster than the database." I pretended not to notice. I knew from experience that arrogance ages faster than experience does. The department was drowning in outdated records. The digital archive system had not been properly synced in 3 years. Hard copies filled the corridors in leaning towers of folders. The director of logistics blamed budget cuts. The younger analysts blamed the previous admin who had retired in silence. I spent my first month cleaning, not sweeping floors but organizing chaos. Each file had its own rhythm. I built a color-coded system to cross-reference supply shipments with security clearances. The colonel signed off without reading. He only cared that the reports landed on his desk on time. Most men in that office believed paperwork was beneath them. They thought power meant shouting across conference tables. I knew power meant accuracy. One afternoon, 2 technicians named Grant and O'Leary mocked my method while mislabeling a classified shipment form. "You spend too much time with those paper walls," Grant said. I smiled and asked if they had double-checked their clearance codes. They laughed. "We know what we are doing, ma'am." That night, I stayed late reviewing the forms they had filed. The codes were mismatched by a single digit. The error rerouted a container from the secure dock to a civilian contractor site. I did not correct it. Instead, I documented the mistake, timestamped the file, and waited. 3 days later, the audit team arrived unannounced. The 2 technicians were questioned for breaching security protocol. The colonel's voice boomed through the hallway as he demanded explanations. I walked in quietly with a single flash drive. "Sir, I said the data trail shows an input discrepancy at 19:04 hours cross-linked to user ID Grant O." The colonel turned toward me. "You have proof." I plugged in the drive and projected the log. One line of code appeared red among hundreds of green. I tapped a key, correcting the digit, and the entire chain realigned. Shipment secured. Problem solved. Silence filled the room. The colonel dismissed the auditors and told the men to step out. Then he looked at me differently, as if seeing through the desk for the first time. "You saved us from a federal incident, Mercer," he said. I told him I only read what was in front of me. After that day, the nickname Paper Lady disappeared. They called me coordinator sometimes, ma'am, with a little more respect. But respect in the military is often temporary. A week later, another analyst joked that I must have worked in admin too long to understand combat rhythm. I smiled and said, "Rhythm is about timing, not noise." The colonel laughed quietly in the corner. He still did not know who I was. My file listed service history without decorations. The Medal of Honor citation had been buried under a classified tag that few civilians could access. I preferred it that way. Power was quieter when no one knew where it came from. The office culture remained a mix of bravado and bureaucracy. Meetings stretched for hours over things that could have been solved in minutes. I started automating reports using old code I had written in Afghanistan. It cut the weekly workload by half. Some resented me for it. Efficiency threatens those who depend on inefficiency for validation. I learned to let their resentment breathe. It made them predictable. One Friday afternoon, as we prepared for an inspection, the entire server crashed. Panic spread faster than reason. The younger analysts shouted over each other, trying to assign blame. The colonel entered his face tight. I checked the system log and saw that someone had tried to bypass the firewall with an unauthorized macro. It had triggered an internal lockdown. I traced the origin to Grant again. He stammered that he was only testing a shortcut. I asked permission to access the secure shell. The colonel hesitated, then nodded. I typed in a few lines of code resetting the root protocol, and the server flickered back to life. Reports reappeared. The colonel exhaled and said, "Whatever you did, keep doing it." The rest of the team clapped lightly, half in relief, half in confusion. When the room cleared, he lingered. "Mercer," he said, "where did you learn to read code like that?" I looked at him and said, "Sir, the Navy teaches you plenty if you listen closely." He smiled, maybe thinking I was joking, but his tone changed after that. He began copying me on high-level emails, asking my opinion before decisions. Trust in his world was rare currency. I earned it one corrected line at a time. Still, I noticed the small gestures of dismissal from others. When I walked into the cafeteria, conversations paused. Some men lowered their voices as if I might report them for something invisible. They called me disciplined in public but said cold behind my back. It did not bother me. Cold keeps you clear. At home, I began sleeping better. The rhythm of paperwork replaced the rhythm of nightmares. Each file I closed felt like a step further from the years of fire and noise. Sometimes during late nights at the base when the halls emptied and the hum of servers filled the silence, I looked at my reflection in the glass wall. The faint outline of the Medal of Honor frame at home flashed through my mind. I imagined what they would say if they knew the woman fixing their forms once directed a rescue under mortar fire. Probably nothing. They would only rewrite it to fit their comfort. I preferred the truth to live quietly. On my desk, I kept a single note folded inside my planner. It read, "Keep time, not grudges." That line guided my patience. Every system had its moment of collapse, every ego its audit. I did not need to prove anything yet. The right mistake would do it for me. Ethan Walsh arrived at the base on a Tuesday morning that smelled of printer ink and rain. The communications wing had just been repainted, all pale beige walls and new screens that no one knew how to use properly. He walked in like someone used to being noticed carrying a slim laptop under one arm and a cup of overpriced coffee in the other. The security guard barely stopped him. Contractors with clearance always moved differently with that loose arrogance of people who believed badges were shortcuts to respect. He looked around the office, scanning nameplates like reading a menu, then his eyes landed on mine. Mercer D. He read aloud, dragging the syllables with an amused tone. Secretary. Cute. I looked up from the monitor and met his gaze. He had the kind of smile that asked for applause before doing anything worth it. I said quietly, "I used to coordinate airstrikes. Coffee's simpler." He chuckled, leaning against the doorway. "Sure you did, ma'am." His voice had that smooth PR cadence, the kind meant to sell sincerity in 30 seconds or less. Around us, a few junior staffers tried not to laugh. I turned back to my screen and resumed typing. Silence settled sharp and deliberate. The sound of his cup lid clicking open broke it again. He started talking about his assignment, something about refreshing the base's public image and creating short video features for the Navy's outreach program. The colonel had approved his contract, though no one in our department had asked for it. Ethan called it storytelling. I called it noise. Within an hour, he had turned the conference room into his personal studio ring lights, glaring off the metal cabinets. He interviewed a few of the younger analysts, asking them about teamwork and innovation, using words that belonged in advertising more than defense. I watched from my desk as he gestured wildly, his laughter echoing through the hall. At one point, he passed my station again. "You've got a good face for camera," he said. I smiled. "Only if you need someone filing forms in the background." He grinned wider, assuming it was modesty. Later that afternoon, while he waited for a meeting with Colonel Hayes, he wandered near my workspace again. He noticed the framed photo on the shelf behind me, the one reflecting softly in the glass wall. "What's that, your husband's award?" he asked. The light caught the edge of the medal's ribbon gold against navy blue. I answered, "It's paperwork." He nodded like he understood, though he didn't. The next day, he brought his camera into our office. He said he was shooting B-roll for a segment about base operations. The colonel approved it, and suddenly every mundane task became part of his vision. He filmed technicians pretending to work officers, pretending to look thoughtful, and even the janitor pushing a mop with theatrical intensity. When he turned the lens toward me, I didn't look up. He asked if I could type something dramatic for the footage. I said, "Just let me know when you want the explosions." He laughed that same bright, careless sound. Later, I overheard him in the hallway telling another contractor that some of the retired staffers here still thought they were saving the world. His tone dripped with amusement, the kind that feels harmless until it cuts deep. That night, I stayed late to close the system logs. The office emptied except for the hum of computers and the faint click of rain against the windows. I saw the reflection again on the glass behind me, the metal glinting from its frame, steady, unbothered. I wondered how long a person like Ethan could survive in a world that demanded silence over showmanship. The next morning, he returned with a new idea. He wanted to make a video called Heroes at the Desk, featuring civilian workers who transitioned from service life to office life. He said it would be lighthearted, inspiring, and a little funny. I listened as he pitched it to the colonel, who nodded without catching the mockery. Ethan's eyes flicked to me during the presentation, as if he had already decided who would play the comic relief. That afternoon, he asked if I could help him pull personnel files for background stories. He smiled when I hesitated. "Don't worry, ma'am, it's just for morale," he said. "I accessed only the public records, nothing more." He scrolled through the names, reading aloud bits of career summaries, stopping when he reached Mercer Diana. He raised an eyebrow. "No rank listed," he said. "Guess admin runs deep." I didn't correct him. The less he knew, the more precise the fall would be. Over the next week, Ethan's presence became constant. He moved through the office like a camera looking for a subject each interaction, a rehearsal for something he hadn't told anyone yet. The younger officers admired him. He was charming, articulate, and knew exactly how to flatter authority. But charm built on ignorance always collapses under truth. On Friday, he invited the team to a small after-work gathering to preview his new video series. I declined, citing deadlines. He winked and said, "Come on, you might be the star." I replied, "Some of us retired from that kind of spotlight." He didn't understand. That evening, after everyone left, I noticed his camera still connected to one of the base servers transferring data. A folder labeled Draft. Heroes glowed faintly on the screen. I clicked it open. There was footage of the office candid shots, including clips of me typing, filing, even pausing by the window. The file name read Secretary B. Roll. Under it, a second folder titled Jokes. Inside, short outtakes of Ethan mocking the older staffers. One clip had him saying to the camera, "Some of these people think paperwork wins wars." The next cut showed me walking past, unaware. His smirk filled the frame. I closed the folder and unplugged the drive. That night, I went home, poured tea, and sat in front of the metal. Its reflection trembled slightly under the kitchen light, like it was waiting for breath. There are moments when restraint becomes its own kind of power, and silence its sharpest edge. I whispered to the empty room, "Let him film." Every story needs its correction. The veterans' reception in June 2024 drew every stripe of uniform and every shade of memory into the base auditorium. The hall smelled of polished wood and coffee, the stage washed in a warm glow that made even the oldest ribbons shine like fresh metal. Banners hung from the ceiling with careful symmetry. A brass quartet warmed up near the wings while public affairs shuttled dignitaries toward their assigned seats. I stood at the back by the double doors, a program folded twice in my hand so it would fit neatly inside my bag. Ethan moved across the front rows with the bright energy of a host, directing camera angles, testing microphones, making small adjustments to lights that were already perfect. He wore the confident smile of a man convinced that applause could be scheduled. The colonel stood near the lectern, reviewing remarks, his expression focused, unaware that the story he was about to introduce would turn on him in the best way. I watched the audience settle. Retired chiefs sat beside young ensigns. A pair of Gold Star parents held hands in the second row. The room felt steady, like the whole building had taken one deep breath and was waiting to exhale. When the house lights dimmed, the quartet fell silent and the projector screen softened to a pale blue. Ethan stepped to the microphone and welcomed everyone to an evening of gratitude and stories. He spoke with that practiced warmth that belongs to advertisements and commencements. He said the Navy is a family and that families share their journeys. He said we would begin with a short feature about the unsung heroes who keep the pier running. The title card appeared in a cheerful font, Heroes at the Desk. The opening shot was our corridor, the camera sliding past nameplates and binders stacked just so. The music was light and a little playful. The first cut showed a young analyst tapping on a keyboard with exaggerated focus. The second cut showed a janitor pushing a mop in slow motion like a parade. Laughter rippled softly through the audience. Then I appeared, not my face first, but my hands arranging forms with the calm precision of someone loading a magazine. The caption identified me as Diana Secretary. The camera caught me rising to adjust a printer tray. The music shifted to a whimsical note, the kind that invites a chuckle. A few people obliged. The edit continued with quick jumps, me crossing the hall, me setting a coffee cup on a coaster, me nodding once, as someone asked a question that never made the audio. The cut made me look small, almost decorative. Ethan had a talent for shaping perception. He spoke over the footage about transitions, about how service becomes support, about how every office has a quiet backbone. My jaw stayed loose, my breathing even. I had learned in another life to wait for the wind to change. The next segment queued up labeled Retired Staffers. The first clip showed a gray-haired supply clerk fumbling with a tablet before laughing at his own mistake. The second clip showed a woman in admin dropping a binder that burst open like a paper snowstorm. Soft, polite laughter. This was the tone he had chosen, affectionate and condescending at once. I could feel discomfort slide across parts of the audience. People who knew the weight of support work shifted in their seats. The colonel looked down at his notes, uncertain whether to smile. Then something strange happened. A small flicker ran through the projection, a line of static from the bottom of the screen to the top, thin as a hair, and gone. The image paused for less than a second, resumed, then staggered again, as if the film had caught on a hidden nail. Ethan glanced toward the tech booth with a quick frown. I kept my eyes on the screen. The third flicker did not resolve. The auditorium audio dipped, hissed softly, then the picture froze on the frame of me turning toward the window. The pause stretched just long enough for whispers to begin. Someone coughed. A crew member at the back started to rise, but the screen shifted before he could move. The blue wash replaced by a darker tone. The resolution sharpening like a lens had finally come into focus. New footage filled the rectangle. It looked older, the color flatter, the camera steadier. A seal appeared at the top of the frame, bright against the dark background. The caption read, Department of Defense Medal Presentation, 2009. No music, no narration, only the clear sound of a podium microphone being adjusted. A general in dress uniform stepped into view, opened a folder, and began to speak in a measured voice. The citations for extraordinary heroism read like a list of weather reports from a storm you thought had passed. He named the location. He named the date. He read my name. The room inhaled. The camera cut to an angle that showed me 10 years younger hair, darker face thinned by months in theater, standing with hands at my sides as the medal was placed around my neck. The ribbon caught the light and threw it back into the lens. The general said the nation thanks you. The screen faded briefly to the seal again, then to the official text of the citation. 12 rescued under direct fire. Actions beyond the call of duty. Communication coordination conducted at extreme personal risk. Every phrase was a door opening that somebody once tried to keep closed. In the front row, a woman covered her mouth with both hands. A few chairs creaked as people leaned forward. Someone whispered, "That cannot be the same Diana." It was. I felt the familiar weight in my chest, not of fear, but of recognition arriving late and exact. The footage lingered on my face that brief second after the metal settled, when my eyes drifted toward the ceiling as if measuring the distance between noise and quiet. Then the screen cut to black and returned to the paused frame of heroes at the desk, the one where I stood in a wash of afternoon light near the window. Only now that image looked different. The audience saw what had been hiding in plain sight since the first day Ethan pointed a camera into our office. The glass frame behind me, just at the edge of focus, held the Medal of Honor. The room did not breathe for a full count of 3. Somewhere a program slid from a lap to the floor with a soft whisper. Ethan swallowed hard enough for the front row to notice. He looked toward the tech booth, his face pale, then turned back to the crowd with an unsteady smile. "Minor technical glitch," he said. "We will get right back to the feature." His voice cracked on the last word. The colonel stood. He did not glance at Ethan. He looked at the screen and then at me. And in that movement, I saw comprehension flood a map that had been blank for years. He stepped away from the lectern and walked toward the lip of the stage until the spotlight caught the white of his hair. He faced me across the rows and brought his hand up in a crisp salute. The sound of fabric as jackets straightened filled the hall like a low drum. People rose without being asked. The old chiefs stood first, then the ensigns, then the civilians who knew the language well enough to follow. The colonel held the salute until the room steadied around it. "Lieutenant Commander Mercer, ma'am." He said, the microphone catching each word, "Thank you for your service." The syllables landed with the gravity of an overdue debt. Paid in full. I did not cry. My hands remained still at my sides. I only nodded once because anything more would have broken the clean lines of the moment. Ethan tried to speak again, but the words faltered. He looked down at his tablet, tapped the screen, and the compliant smile he had worn for a week finally slipped. He understood that the joke had rewritten itself mid-sentence. I walked down the side aisle slowly, not toward the stage and not toward the exit, but to a point where I could see the entire room. Faces were turned toward me in a way that had nothing to do with being filmed. It felt like standing in a clearing after a storm and finding every tree still upright. The colonel lowered his salute and met me at the edge of the first row. He said softly, "I should have known." I said, even softer, "The work spoke for me." He nodded, then turned back to the audience and signaled for the quartet. They began the slow rising notes of a hymn that always sounds like memory being cleaned. Ethan backed away from the microphone and faded into the wings. In the shadow line near the curtain, he looked at me with confusion and something like shame. I did not offer comfort. He had written a story about people he did not understand. Now the edit belonged to someone who did. As the music lifted, I leaned toward him just enough for only him to hear. "Next time you write a story, make sure you know who edits history." His expression collapsed into silence. The rest of the evening unfolded with the grace of a ceremony that finally found its center. Speeches shortened themselves. Applause found the right targets. I sat near the back again and let the room hold its own weight. When the lights came up, people lingered not to be seen, but to share quiet phrases that fit inside a handshake. A young sailor approached and said my grandmother served too. I told him to tell her thank you. Outside, the night air felt new. The breeze off the water carried the smell of salt and ship paint. As I walked across the parking lot, I could hear the distant clink of halyards against a flagpole. The metal waited at home behind its glass. For years, I had kept it there because noise frightened me more than memory. Tonight, the glass felt less like a wall and more like a window. I thought about the pocket watch in my drawer and the way its tick can still steady my breath. Timing is everything. Patience is a fuse you light without smoke. Would you have stayed quiet just long enough for the truth to detonate? The week after the reception, the base turned into a storm made of whispers. Every hallway conversation carried fragments of the same story, the viral kind, that spreads faster than official memos. Someone had leaked the footage online, a short clip showing the moment the Medal of Honor ceremony replaced Ethan's video. Within hours, it had been reposted across veteran forums with captions like "The Secretary Who Wasn't." The Public Affairs Office tried to contain it, but pride is harder to manage than scandal. News outlets called asking for comment. The colonel refused all interviews, though I heard him speaking to the admiral, once voice low and full of phrases like misunderstanding and context. By Thursday, Ethan's company had been formally dropped from their contract. The report cited breach of professionalism and misrepresentation of personnel. He was escorted out of the communications building with a cardboard box and a silence so thick it almost felt ceremonial. He avoided looking at me as he passed my desk, but I caught the flicker of humiliation in his eyes, the way realization ages a man overnight. After he left, the colonel came to my office. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, hat tucked under his arm, then said, "I owe you more than an apology." I told him he owed me honesty, and he nodded. He asked if I'd planned the exposure. I said timing is everything. He did not ask again. The following morning, he issued a public statement to the base staff. It was brief but exact. He acknowledged the oversight and expressed gratitude for my service, naming my rank and commendation aloud. When he finished speaking, the room stayed still. Then the youngest officer in the back started clapping. The rest followed. The sound was different from the applause at the reception. It was quieter, almost careful, as if everyone wanted to touch respect without breaking it. That afternoon, I returned to my routine. Paperwork had never looked so peaceful. I replaced the plain nameplate outside my door with a new one I had printed myself in the admin shop. It read, "Secretary's Office Medal, Recipients Only." The joke was light enough to pass for humility, but sharp enough to sting anyone who needed the reminder. The colonel saw it later that day and smiled. He said, "Humor looks good on discipline." I told him it keeps the air from getting stale. For the first time since joining that office, laughter felt clean. By the end of the week, the PR department had been reorganized. The new liaison, a woman named Captain Renner, stopped by to ask for my input on their communications protocol. She said she wanted fewer slogans and more truth. I told her truth sells itself when you stop editing it. She wrote that down like it was strategy. Word about Ethan spread beyond the base. His company released a statement claiming creative misunderstanding. The internet was less forgiving. The comments sections became a study in collective morality. Some called me a hero twice over others called him an example. I did not read much beyond that. Justice does not need applause. It needs consequence. Still, I allowed myself one small indulgence. I installed a doorbell on my office door that played the opening notes of taps whenever pressed. It was my private way of saying lessons learned. The first time Ethan returned, escorted by security to sign his exit paperwork, he pressed the button without looking at it. The melody rang through the corridor, soft and mournful. His face froze halfway between confusion and shame. I smiled politely and said it seems to suit the occasion. He said nothing, only nodded and left the papers on my desk. When he turned to go, I added, "Next time, try a quieter job." He managed a weak smile before walking away. After he left, the colonel appeared again, shaking his head in disbelief. "You're enjoying this a little, aren't you?" he said. I answered only the paperwork. That became our unspoken truce. Over the next few days, life settled back into its rhythm. The base ran smoother, the gossip thinned, and even the air felt lighter. The younger officers began stopping by my office with questions about logistics, sometimes just to listen. Respect had shifted from curiosity to habit. The colonel reinstated my clearance for interdepartmental briefings. During one meeting, he referred to me not as Ms. Mercer or administrative coordinator, but as Lieutenant Commander Mercer. The title slid across the room like a bell note. Nobody laughed. That night, I stayed late again, finishing reports. The hum of computers filled the silence, steady and familiar. Outside, the sunset burned low over the bay, turning the water the same color as old brass. I looked at the reflection in the glass wall, the faint outline of the metal's frame behind me. The day had ended the way I liked best, not with applause, but with stillness. Before leaving, I straightened the new nameplate and pressed the doorbell once. The slow echo of taps drifted through the hallway. I thought of Ethan hearing it in his sleep and smiled. Some lessons needed a melody. Revenge, when balanced with humor, becomes clarity. In that sound, I found peace sharper than anger. Justice had already been served. This was just the encore. It was late October when the news finally reached Mark. The article had been circulating online for weeks, a small headline buried between political noise and celebrity chatter. Former Navy officer revealed as Medal of Honor recipient after viral video. My name was printed beneath the photo from the reception, the same image now framed in 1,000 reposts. Mark must have read it 3 times before deciding what it meant for him. 2 days later, his truck appeared in my driveway, the sound of its engine dragging through the morning quiet like a cough that refused to die. I watched from the kitchen window as he stepped out wearing a jacket that did not fit and a grin that pretended to be brotherly. He rang the bell. The faint chime of taps echoed from my office door, and I smiled to myself before opening it. "Sis," he said, "people know your name now. We could build something." His eyes glimmered with the old spark of opportunity, the same look he had whenever he found a new angle to exploit. I leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "You built enough lies already," I said. He laughed a short, brittle sound. "Come on, Di, don't be dramatic. You've got fame now. They love the story of the quiet hero. We could start a foundation, get interviews, sponsorships, even a documentary." He spoke quickly as if the words could outrun my silence. I waited until he stopped to breathe. "You mean you could?" I said. His jaw tightened. "Don't do that," he said. "Don't act like you're above family." I told him I had tried being part of it once, but survival required better company. He followed me into the kitchen without being invited, looking around as if inventorying the life he thought he deserved a share of. "You've changed," he said. "You think you're some kind of legend now." I poured coffee and answered evenly. "No. I think I finally stopped apologizing." The air thickened. His voice rose. "All those years you let me take the heat," he said. "You think you're clean, but you're not. You hide behind those medals and papers while the rest of us struggle." I set the mug down the porcelain-touching wood with a quiet click. "What heat did you take, Mark? The loans you forged under my name, the debts you blamed on Mom, the jobs you lost because of your mouth, that heat." He slammed his hand on the table, the sound sharp enough to rattle the spoon beside my cup. "Don't talk to me like I'm one of your recruits," he shouted. "I'm your brother. You owe me respect." I stared at him, calm enough to make his anger look childish. Respect is earned in silence, remember. He frowned, not recognizing the words my grandfather had once spoken to both of us. I walked past him to the study, opened the cabinet, and pulled out a thick manila folder. The stamp on the cover caught the light, NCIS Naval Criminal Investigative Service. I placed it gently on the table between us. He looked down, confused. "What is this?" I told him it was his record, the one he thought no one remembered. He hesitated before opening it. Inside were copies of his old fraud investigations, the DUIs, the false applications, and the financial trail from the insurance job he lost. The seal made it official enough to hurt. His face drained color as he flipped through the pages. "Where did you get this?" he asked quietly. I told him paperwork never forgets. He swallowed hard, then tried to recover. "You wouldn't," he said. "You wouldn't ruin your own family." I smiled, slow and deliberate. "You already did that." He stepped back, bumping the chair behind him. His voice shook now. "They could put me in jail for this." I nodded. "Or you could finally tell the truth and start paying what you owe." He sank into the chair, eyes darting from the folder to me as if searching for mercy. I poured him a cup of coffee and placed it near his trembling hands. The silence between us grew heavy but not cruel. He said I was just trying to make something of myself. I told him that building something on someone else's name isn't creation, it's theft. For a moment he looked smaller than I had ever seen him, stripped of the arrogance that once filled every room. He said softly, "What do you want from me?" I said I wanted accountability, not revenge. He looked up, confused by the difference. I explained. Revenge feeds the ego. Accountability rebuilds the world after the fire. He didn't answer. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, brushing against the windows with a sound like distant surf. I stood and walked to the doorway. You have 1 week to clear your debts and return what's left of Mom's money. If not, that file goes to the authorities. His lips parted, but no words came. I could see the calculation behind his eyes, the panic colliding with pride. I left him there, sitting under the soft hum of the ceiling light, the folder open like a mirror reflecting everything he had tried to hide. After a long moment, he whispered, "You always win, don't you?" I turned and said, "Not always. Sometimes I just stop losing." When he finally left the door closed without force, I watched his truck pull away, the taillights fading into the dusk. The house felt still again, cleaner somehow. I picked up the folder and placed it back into the cabinet. Justice doesn't always need witnesses. Later that night, I sat by the window, the metal glowing faintly under the lamp. I thought about how every story eventually circles back to truth, no matter how far the detour. My phone buzzed with a message from the colonel, simple words, "Proud of you, ma'am." I smiled and typed back, just keeping things in order. When I turned off the light, the house settled into its quiet rhythm, the clock ticking steady as breath. Would you call it revenge or accountability? I decided it didn't matter. What mattered was the silence that followed, heavy, clean, and deserved. The auditorium at Norfolk Naval Station filled again this time without fanfare or apology. The banners read, "Women of Valor," and beneath them rows of uniforms and civilians settled into neat lines. The event was meant to highlight stories of perseverance, the kind that does not make front pages but shapes the lives of those who serve. I sat backstage watching the crowd through the thin curtain, listening to the muffled conversations. The scent of floor polish and fresh coffee drifted through the air. The colonel approached, clipboard in hand, his posture straighter than usual. He said the command wanted me to close the program. I told him I was not a public speaker. He smiled and said that was precisely why they wanted me. When they introduced me, the applause started politely, a recognition of duty more than fame. I walked to the podium, the stage lights warm against my face. The room quieted. I looked out at the sea of uniforms and saw reflections of the past faces, young enough to believe in perfection and old enough to know better. I began softly. They called me a secretary. The words hung there for a moment. A few people smiled, thinking I was starting with humor. But the smile faded as I continued. They called me a secretary, I said again, but the best commands I ever issued were to save lives. The silence that followed was whole and heavy. Then the applause came slow at first, then building until the sound filled every corner of the hall. It was not wild or performative. It was gratitude layered with respect. I spoke about quiet leadership, about the kind of power that comes from listening more than talking. I told them that medals gather dust, but choices echo. I talked about how discipline is not obedience, but balance, how humility is not submission, but control. When I finished, I closed my notes and said simply, "The uniform fades, but integrity does not." The standing ovation lasted longer than I expected. Cameras flashed, though none of them belonged to Ethan's old crew. A journalist from the Navy Times asked for a photo and later wrote an article titled, "The Quiet Commander." The story spread through veteran circles and beyond. For the first time, the narrative belonged to truth instead of spectacle. That same week, I received a letter from the Department of Justice confirming that Mark had been indicted for tax fraud. They had reopened his case after cross-referencing his name through an audit of small business filings. I knew he had ignored my warning. The file I had shown him was never just leverage. It was a prelude to consequence. The letter did not ask for a statement, but it thanked me for providing clarity. I folded it neatly and placed it beside the pocket watch. Some debts collect themselves. A few days later, an email arrived from an unfamiliar address. It was Ethan. The subject line read, "Recommendation request." His message was brief and painfully formal. He explained that he had applied for a communications position with a nonprofit organization and that they required references from previous collaborations. He wrote, "I know things ended poorly, but I've learned from it. Any word of support would mean a lot." I read it twice before responding. The cursor blinked for a long time before I typed. My reply was one line, competent at making noise. I signed it with my name and rank attached no sentiment and sent it. The confirmation ping echoed like a full stop. Public karma is rarely loud. It moves in clean circles, balancing what arrogance unravels. The following morning, the colonel stopped by my office holding a printed copy of the Navy Times article. He laid it on my desk, smiling. "They finally got your title right," he said. I looked at the headline and replied, "They were bound to eventually." He laughed quietly and asked what was next for me. I told him I was starting something small, a mentorship program for women transitioning from service to civilian life. He nodded approvingly and said, "You never really stop commanding, do you?" I told him I just prefer when orders sound like advice. That night, I attended a small dinner organized by the Women of Valor Committee. It was intimate, less about ceremony and more about connection. Over candlelight and quiet conversation, I listened to younger women share stories of the obstacles they faced, age-rank dismissal. Each voice carried the same thread: resilience, disguised as endurance. I realized that survival had its own dialect, and I spoke it fluently. One woman asked what advice I would give to those starting over. I said, "Never let anyone decide your rank for you." When I left the dinner, the night air was cool, carrying the smell of the bay. The moon hung low over the water, calm and deliberate. I walked past the pier where ships slept, their reflections trembling on the surface. The metal at home waited on the wall, no longer hidden behind glass. It did not need protection anymore. The next morning, I arrived at the base early. The sun was just rising, painting everything gold. On my desk sat a small note from the colonel. It said, "Thank you for reminding us what respect sounds like." I placed it under the nameplate and smiled. In the hallway outside, the new PR staff was installing a plaque commemorating the reception. My name was etched among others, the letters clean and even. The younger analysts paused to look at it as they passed, whispering quietly. I caught fragments hero calm legend, but none of it felt like mine alone. It belonged to every person who had ever been underestimated and still chosen excellence over anger. Before leaving that afternoon, I looked once more at the line on my door, Secretary's Office Medal, recipients only. It had started as a joke, but now it felt like a statement of lineage. I turned off the lights, listened to the hum fade, and thought about how far silence can carry when truth finally walks beside it. Outside, the flag rippled against the wind, sharp and sure. Justice had done its work. The rest was grace. 1 year later, the house no longer felt like a bunker. Morning light fell through the curtains in soft rectangles, warming the wooden floor where dust motes drifted like quiet thoughts. Norfolk's harbor still hummed every dawn, but the sound no longer carried tension. It was rhythm, now the kind that comes after you stop measuring time in battles. The newspaper on the porch carried an article about the Silent Service Mentorship, a new program I had started for women veterans transitioning back to civilian life. The headline read, "Building Bridges of Quiet Strength." I smiled at the phrasing. It sounded softer than the truth. The office sat 2 blocks from the pier in a renovated warehouse that once stored naval supplies. We painted the walls pale gray and filled the space with mismatched chairs donated by bases across the state. On one wall hung photographs of women in uniform, some smiling, some solemn, all anchored by the same unspoken language of endurance. The program began small, a dozen women meeting twice a week to talk about everything the manuals never cover: identity, silence, dignity. Some had served 20 years, others barely 2, but each carried the same invisible weight. They called me ma'am at first, then Diana once comfort replaced caution. The first session felt tentative. They spoke about loss, about the way the world forgets those who return without wounds. I listened, offering few words, only nods, knowing that recognition is sometimes more powerful than advice. By the third week, laughter began to break through the pauses. One woman brought cookies shaped like anchors. Another brought her teenage daughter to watch what strength looks like in its quietest form. The Navy sent a representative from community outreach who stayed the entire afternoon instead of the planned hour. She said she wanted to learn how we built trust so easily. I told her we stopped trying to sell redemption and started acknowledging reality. At the end of each meeting, I wrote a single phrase on the whiteboard. The first was, "Silence is not surrender." The second, "Honor has many uniforms." The third, "Respect grows in the dark." The women began adding their own lines beside mine until the wall became a tapestry of their truths. At home, I kept the medal in its usual place on the shelf near my grandfather's watch. For years, it had stayed behind a glass cover safe from dust and memory. But now the glass felt unnecessary. One afternoon, I removed it, carefully polishing the frame until the gold gleamed again. I hung it on the wall of the mentorship office between two photographs, one of my unit in Afghanistan, the other of the first group of mentees standing together by the pier. The medal caught the sunlight and threw it across the floor. A younger mentor named Lena Cross stopped by that day bringing coffee and a new stack of applications. She was in her early 30s, sharp, thoughtful, the kind of woman who balanced humor and gravity with natural grace. She noticed the medal immediately and froze for a moment. "You took it out," she said. I nodded. She smiled faintly. "May I ask why now?" I set the coffee down and looked at the reflection of the medal on the opposite wall. "Because respect isn't given," I said. "It's remembered." She nodded slowly, repeating the words under her breath like a vow. Later that afternoon, we hosted a workshop for the new cohort. The theme was Legacy Without Noise. I asked each woman to write a letter to her past self, the version that doubted the version that stayed quiet for fear of being misunderstood. The room filled with the soft scratch of pens. Some tears fell, some laughter broke the tension, and when it ended, we gathered the letters in a sealed box labeled, "Keep Time, Not Grudges." I promised we would open it next year together. After everyone left, I stayed behind to tidy the room. The sunset over Norfolk painted the windows in orange and gold. Outside, the pier lights flickered on one by one. I could hear the low thrum of a ship engine somewhere beyond the horizon, steady as a heartbeat. On the table lay the old pocket watch still ticking. It had survived every deployment, every fire, every silence. I wound it once, feeling the familiar resistance in its gears, the sound small but certain. Each click felt like a reminder that time itself can heal if you let it breathe. That night back home, I sat by the window with the sea breeze drifting through the open glass. The metal glowed softly against the wall, no longer a secret, no longer a shield. It was just truth made visible. My phone buzzed with a message from one of the mentees. She had written, "I spoke at my daughter's school today. I told them about service. Thank you for reminding me who I am." I stared at the message for a long moment before replying, "You reminded yourself." I closed the phone and listened to the rhythm of waves outside. Somewhere down the street, a ship horn echoed deep and slow, the sound rolling through the night like an old promise kept. I thought of my grandfather, of the young woman who had once fled Kentucky, with nothing but courage, of Caleb, of every silence that had built the road to now. For the first time in years, I felt the balance between grief and grace tilt toward peace. The pocket watch ticked on steady and defiant, its silver face catching the moonlight. I whispered the words I wished someone had told me at 18. Silence isn't weakness, it's preparation. The room stayed still, and the sea answered, with the soft rhythm of its waves, folding the night into something gentle. If you've ever been dismissed, share this. Silence isn't weakness, it's preparation.